All right. So I admit today's podcast guest, I was drawn to her because she has the coolest last name ever. And then I needed to know more. So we have on our podcast today, we have Megan James, who is a PhD student, and she is studying postpartum return to run. And again, like beyond having an awesome last name, the fact that you're diving into this research, I bow down to you. So welcome to the podcast, Megan James.
Thank you very much for having me on. No, it's nice to come and talk about what I'm doing, really. So I'm a PhD student at Cardiff Met Uni in Wales. Just going into my kind of second year of my PhD now. So we've kind of started getting a few things up and running, but it's still kind of early stages at the moment.
Awesome. So let's dive right in. Like as a PhD student, like what made you decide to look into this? Because it's not the sexiest, it's not the most popular thing. Like what made you decide to look at postpartum women and running?
Yeah, it was, like as you say, I think if I'd have gone back a few years ago, I don't think I'd ever thought I'd have ended up doing this kind of area of study, because it's not the kind of thing you think that you're going to do when you're like starting your undergrad, or just it doesn't appear as something that's really obvious that you should get into. So I did my undergrad degree at Swansea University in sport and exercise science. And when I did that, kind of got more interested into the injury side of things rather than kind of sporting performance. Because I know when you kind of start doing your undergrad in sports science, everyone's thinking, oh, I want to go and work at the elite rugby, football, whatever teams.
Right.
Which, I thought maybe beforehand, I thought maybe I would. But I kind of got more interested into the injury side of things. Did a dissertation looking at kind of asymmetries between limbs in field hockey. And doing my dissertation, I really enjoyed the research aspect. So I thought, okay, I'm going to go on and do a master's. Did a master's in sports science at Cardiff Met. Kind of got interested in running and running injuries. So my current supervisor, Dr. Izzy Moore, I met in my master's, and she's obviously super big name in running and running injuries, and I got interested in that working with her. And my kind of dissertation for my master's focused on running. It got a little bit kind of interrupted by COVID. So we did have to change the focus a little bit and things like that, but kind of running injuries, and then started focusing on the pelvis in that particular dissertation project. And then kind of because everything was interrupted with COVID, there were certain studies going on that you maybe wouldn't have necessarily normally done. So Izzy got involved with a kind of survey study that we've now released papers from, looking at kind of postpartum return to running and experiences of postpartum women returning to running. So she said to me, do you want to jump onto this, come and help out with this while you're doing your master's? And I thought, it sounds something different that I haven't done before. It's like a different kind of analysis. It's a different population. It's still running, but it's kind of a different population then.
Yeah.
And I got involved with that, and it just, really enjoyed it. Obviously spoke to some friends and family who were experiencing the same things that I was researching, if they just had kids. I just kind of started getting quite interested in it, and then spoke to Izzy after we kind of finished the kind of analysis for those, and she was like, so do you fancy maybe carrying on, and let's look at kind of applying for some grants for a PhD? So I thought, it sounds great. And to be honest, since then it's been working in that field, the kind of people you speak to, either if it's engagement on social media, where they see your research, kind of, when we're looking for volunteers, or even through survey responses, the reaction you get from people who are just so glad that you're doing research into that area, it just feels quite fulfilling. So it's definitely kind of, it's been nice to be involved in an area where you're thinking, I'm actually having potentially, if I do a good job, a nice impact on these people's lives potentially. It's just kind of grown from there, just applying what I know in sports science, kind of traditional disciplines and concepts in that under-researched population. So
that's fantastic. I mean, clinically, that's kind of what we've had to do too. And much like you, I went into this field not having any kids and thinking, oh, well, it's an area where I can make change. And then for me, it just was a game changer when I had my own kids, being a runner myself. And I think you just appreciate it in an entirely different way. And again, there's so little. It's been great the last couple of years. So you're right on the way up here. It's such a fun time to also see some of these elite moms turning out some serious results. And I think that's just spotlighting it more. But for me, again, like there just was so long that we didn't have research. So now that I think with social media and everything, it's so much easier to be. And I think I just DM'd you. I was like, hey, do you want to, like, you don't know me, but I want to elevate as much as we possibly can, because for somebody to have the background that you have in sports, that's where it's going to come from. Like, I think when you just come from pelvic and you don't understand, running or injury or those sorts of things, it's a very different kind of question. You get kind of stuck in the pelvis, so to speak. So for me, I love the fact you're like, I'm coming at it from here. I love that.
No, I also feel like, as you say, the kind, like with just DMing me and stuff, the community, like either via social media or whatever, is very together on this kind of topic. Like anyone you speak to about it, like researchers or practitioners or just actual volunteers and participants and people in that population are just really like keen to chat to you and see what you're doing. And they're just, they're just glad that you're doing something. So, it's a really nice area to be involved with.
We're nice people.
Yeah.
We're nice people.
It's great.
All right. So pulling from one of the studies, I think this one, we were talking about, all the possibilities that could impact moms when getting back to babies. I had to laugh because for me, like, again, having done this for 20 some odd years, my kids are now 9 and 11. Like, I'm like, yep, absolutely 100%. Like fear, age, did you run during pregnancy, weekly running volume, number of kids that you have, kind of unpack high level sort of what you found in some of these studies that you've done the last couple of years.
Yeah. So the first study we did, we kind of looked at all of these factors, and looked at like in terms of what kind of odds they gave in whether you'd return to running, whether you'd return to like the same level as running as before, because that's equally as important for some people. It's like, okay, well, I've returned to running, but I haven't returned to what I want to return to. So we thought it was important to look at that as well. And we found that kind of running during pregnancy was like gave the highest odds of you then returning to running afterwards, which was quite interesting, because obviously we found that a lot of people stop before, or because of like this kind of stigma around, I should just stop, as soon as I know I'm pregnant. And then following that was having a high weekly running volume. And I guess that's to do with kind of people who are like ultra keen, then think, I really want to get back to it. I suppose if you didn't run as much beforehand, it's not as big a part of your life. So maybe then that doesn't, I don't know, but it could be that. And then the next one down was kind of a lower fear of movement. So we found this in our paper, and it's been mentioned a little bit in other kind of literature, that it's evident that there is this kind of fear of movement in the postpartum population, but it hadn't really been looked at too much with returning to running yet. Well, like there's not a lot on returning to running anyway, but you know what I mean? It hadn't been looked at in that specific context. So it's quite interesting that we found that. And I guess it's to do with like, similarly to treating kind of childbirth as a kind of musculoskeletal injury, that it doesn't often get looked at. If you said to somebody who got injured, like, we're just not going to rehabilitate you and you've just got to start running again, they would be like, what? Is that not, I'm supposed to go through some kind of rehab program. So I guess the fear of movement is like that injury site, I guess, is kind of depends on your delivery mode, but like could, pelvic floor, potentially like abdomen if you've had a cesarean, kind of that fear that you're going to kind of re-injure something, or like, get some pain and that kind of thing. Some of the quotes from people in the survey that we did were things like, I'm worried about my scar tearing, I'm worried about, my kind of perineal tears haven't healed. And it's all that kind of thing where, it's like that psychological component to then returning to running. So that was really interesting. And I think we'll probably focus on that a little bit as we go through the PhD as well, because we're kind of at the moment looking into kind of what's stopping you and helping you return to running a little bit more. So hopefully we can find something useful to try and help with that. And then age, we found so younger people were more likely to return to their kind of pre-pregnancy level of running. So not running altogether, but just the level that they were hitting before. So whether that's related to kind of, as you get older, your priorities might change, or if it's a physical thing, we don't know. But, I think, I'm not sure if I'm correct in saying this, but I think the age of having children is increasing. Like the age where you have your first child is kind of increasing on average. So that's obviously something that means then it's more difficult for people to get back into their like pre-pregnancy level. But also I think I've seen somewhere that potentially like that fear of movement can be higher in older people as well. So it could be that's interacting or something. But again, these things are just, they haven't been explored in enough detail to make really solid claims. But yeah, and then number of children, I think, so we found that having more than one child actually increased your odds of returning to your pre-pregnancy level.
I thought that was really interesting. I was like, there's a sanity issue there. Like we need to get out of the house.
So either, because like you would, I don't know, like before I might have thought, having more than one child, you have less time, you can't run as much. Doesn't make sense. But potentially that previous experience of doing it before as well. So they've gone, I've done it before, this worked, this didn't work. So I know what to do now, and I feel confident that I can do it again, potentially. But it's just very interesting because I just immediately thought more kids, less time, more childcare to have to do. But
I found all of this incredibly interesting, again, through my lens, having two kids. And I was an older mom. I was 34 with my first and 36 with my second. Where we live here, we tend to be an older mom, kind of very driven population here. And I some of the stuff I was just like, yep. If you are running high volume and you're that intense person and you're going to run all the way through, you're going, I'm interested to see later on some of the questions that get asked, because I think some of that plays into kind of advice we give on return to run. And I've spoken about when I have clients that go back to run earlier than they probably should, but there's a question of, are they using that to manage postpartum depression or things like that? You have to be aware of what role does running play in their life. And so it just, I feel like this just opened up this whole can of worms of like, what about this? And what about this? And I think, I'm an older mom, but what about younger moms? Like I loved it in that it put it out there for us to start to now kind of play with and snack on and ask more questions. So that was super cool.
Yeah. And the thing is, I think, like we always talk about, like we want more information so that we can come up with some more guidance and advice and things. But ultimately, the things that we give need to be kind of flexible enough to be individualized to different people, because not everyone's going to be the same. It's like, if you go back to looking at like a musculoskeletal injury, not everyone takes the same amount of time to heal. All of those kind of things, like psychological factors, it's different for everyone. So although we might have guidelines, advice that we do desperately need, because there is not a lot out there, I guess it needs to be usable in a way that people can say, I'm in this kind of rough bracket. Not that we want to kind of bracket people, but just, so that they can kind of think, or monitor it themselves with like their own kind of checks and things, because otherwise if you just give like a blanket of advice, they might be like, well, that's not working for me. So it's just so difficult because there are so many factors,
That's going to be hard but that's why I'm the clinician and you're the researcher, because that's my sweet spot. The gray, like I love that all day long, which is why I could never be a researcher. Like I love that. But the questions that come up for me too are like, what where can we start to educate sooner?
Mm.
I have a daughter, she's 9, at what point, I mean, obviously we're talking about anatomy and this is what your body does and things like that. But like when I look back on the assumptions that I had going into pregnancy, even having, a professional background and this is what I did, like I have to go back and be like, where did some of those biases, where did some of
Yeah.
those thoughts and fears, where did that start? And
Yeah.
how can we take a step back and start to educate and get people to understand that it isn't black and white, it's gray. And that's the beautiful part, and that's where there's so much hope and options, and it depends, we can make things work, because if you don't fit into this one pathway, that's okay.
Yeah,
That's okay.
exactly.
So
Yeah, and I think it is just, like you say, like just getting that education out earlier, because I think
yeah.
if people know about it before, like
Yep.
some people were like replying to the survey saying things like, I didn't understand what impact this was going to have on me, like what
Right.
childbirth was going to mean, like, because people just go, oh, you just, when you're younger and you have family or older siblings or whatever, and they have children, they just have children unless there's any like major complications. You're just like, cool, you've had your baby,
Right.
good to go, less normal life,
Yeah.
But things like the difficult things that happen as a result of it probably aren't discussed because it's embarrassing.
No, right.
Or so I think just talking about those, it's like anything really, I suppose, isn't it? Like talking about it more makes it more normalized, which is, it's fine to normalize it, but you still need to understand that some of the things are a problem and need to be addressed. So they could be common things, but they're still not they shouldn't be happening. Like, urinary incontinence is very common, but it shouldn't happen. It shouldn't be accepted.
Right. Yeah, those stories where, and I think this is where you kind of get mixed messaging, where you're like, well, back in the day, they gave birth in the fields and went on working. And so then you're left thinking, okay, I don't work in a field, I should be fine. But again, like I'm in a generation, I think you're a little bit younger, but where my mom's generation exercised for weight loss. And our generation and the generations going forward, that's not the sole reason. They're doing it for health reasons and for, social reasons. And we're far more active than our previous generations. And so, yes, we were in the fields doing things, but, were we out doing marathons? Were we, deadlifting 300 pounds? I don't know. Like there's a lot of this stuff. So I think how we are using our bodies and how that's become part of our social fabric, I think that's changed too. And so, we're asking these different questions because we have different expectations for what we want to be able to do, and our life expectancy. I was talking to your gynecologist. I was like, well, we're older. And she's like, actually, no, with COVID, our life expectancy has gone down.
Really?
I'm like, oh, sorry. Sorry for the reminder.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So you've been in postpartum research now for a little bit. It's got to feel like a little bit of the desert from an information perspective, coming from, sports and injury management and those sorts of things. What are the biggest gaps? Like what's got you chomping at the bit to, I want to know more about this, or where do you see the biggest holes that potentially might impact us as clinicians and how we can help our moms at home?
Yeah, so as you say, I think it's difficult to pinpoint one thing because it's so
Too much.
like there's so little research that like anything at the moment is great. But I'd say just to give you a bit of background, so my kind of steps of my PhD is to first kind of assess what mums think that they need, things that are stopping them from running and things like that. Then looking how we can kind of gradually come up with some kind of program, monitor that kind of biomechanical loading and psychological kind of reaction and things like that to how they're getting on with loading gradually, and then hopefully doing some kind of program to see, like an intervention kind of program to see if it can help. I'd say like intervention studies in this area are quite they kind of haven't been done an awful lot. Like physical activity, physical activity ones have been done a little bit, and some kind of online ones have been done a little bit as well, which is obviously great in like a post-COVID situation and things where people haven't got access to being close together or whatever. But I think even like people who do interventions that are unsuccessful, it needs to be published, because often if stuff that isn't, if people do studies and they don't show anything and they're not successful, people just don't publish them, which means that then people can't see what hasn't worked. And it's like, that's just as important as finding something that could work, because if you know what hasn't worked, you know not to try it again, and then you can try and kind of focus in on what you could try instead. So I think definitely some kind of practical application kind of studies. But then on the flip side, it would be really great to have more just descriptive data anyway that can inform those kind of interventions, because at the moment we've got such little data on kind of how the population moves. Like, there's so many changes you go through physically, psychologically, that could affect how you move physically, through birth. Morphological differences to like your weight, like, you know what I mean? So many different things.
I do.
But like, it's like people, we want to try and, I suppose, apply some of the return to sport kind of literature concepts, but in a population that we know barely anything about. And even when you look at like return to sport and injury and kind of the musculoskeletal injury literature, there's a kind of bias up until recently on publishing male data as well. So like, we haven't even got information on females before pregnancy. So like, you know what I mean? It's just, I feel like at the moment it's a bit of a cop-out answer, but anything is great.
No, I love that though, because again, I think it's so important when I'm working with a client in clinic. I'm like, I want to lay everything out. And I think it's so important to know and understand why people are starting the way that they're starting. Like, if people are starting back to running, when are they starting and why? Do they start with a couch to 5K, or do they start with a 1 minute walk, 1 minute run? How often does that work? What are the variables that make that work, and what are the variables that don't? Like, there's a million questions.
Definitely.
You probably are just, it's like a smorgasbord of, just keep it coming at this point.
Like, give us information. Like, I think a lot could be done in terms of, as I say, trying to come up with some kind of advice. I don't know if you've seen the published guidelines from 2019 from Tom Goom, Grania Donnelly, and Emma Brockwell. So like, we've worked a little bit with a couple of those guys on some of these projects, and are still working kind of with them a little bit. And I guess some of that is like, backing up because like, they've said that what they've released is very much, this is what we think off clinical opinion, but we've got nothing to base it on, because apart from clinic, which is obviously very valuable, but it needs some evidence to back it up, because there's just not enough work on it yet that we can say kind of super confidently, like, this is with, there's a reason behind doing this. And I think that those guidelines are great. Like, so many people, I think 97% of people who read them in our study said they were useful to helping them return.
That to me was, I remember reading those results and being so excited, because before that, we really didn't have much to go on. And it's interesting, and I've talked to Grania about this, is, at the time, those of us that were in the clinic, we were just grasping at whatever we could. So pulling from, Achilles tendinopathy or bone stress injury because there was impact involved or things like that. And so they did such a great job of saying, all right, let's just take everything and put it here. And then you guys have at it. And so I'm so excited that that's become, I think disseminated is the right word, that so many people, not only professionals, but moms have found that via social media or Google or whatever. And again, it gives us a place to start. It gives us a place to form a conversation that says, we should have something in place. We should have some criteria. You shouldn't necessarily just go out and see what happens. And there's so much value to just saying that. And I'm looking so forward to, whatever a revision looks like that, informed by a lot of the research that I think has been inspired by putting that out into the world. So
Yeah.
No, it's such, again, like wonderful timing to have that pre-pandemic, because again, we've all been chewing on anything that we could get off the internet for the last
Exactly.
couple of years.
Yeah.
That's given you guys time to do those survey type studies that really did need to
Yeah.
happen for us to understand more. So I do think the
Mm.
timing has been, as good at it as it could possibly be. But
Yeah.
again, if it weren't for people like yourself that are like, hey, this is something where I feel like I can make an impact and it's interesting to me, and you have the type of mindset and thinking that this feeds you and serves you, and then we get to benefit from it. Like, again, my brain does not work that way. I will drink from the fire hose and read everything that you have, but I will not.
Yeah, but no, it's very exciting, I think, as well, to think that we could make something that people can just use.
Yes.
And that's why I think as well that research into seeing how people would like to receive that,
Yep.
what kind of format they want it in, to improve that dissemination to
Totally.
either mothers or people who can then pass it on to mothers' health professionals.
Absolutely.
Because then, they can use it. Whereas if they don't hear about it or they can't understand it because we've put it out in some awful format,
Yes.
then it's not as worthwhile. But yeah, so just kind of seeing what people want,
Yeah. And that's where I think, again, trying to figure out the age-old relationship between clinicians and, researchers is like, we can provide you the cases, we can inspire the questions, but if we can also be a megaphone to getting your information out into the world, and making it, user-friendly or facilitating that, like, I think that's where, at least in this corner of the world, from a medical perspective, you can't find a more supportive group of people, because a lot of us that are in it have had our own issues, so it's personal for us too.
I feel like it's a real area where clinicians and researchers are really starting to work together, and it's making a big difference because you're bringing different perspectives and skill sets to the same area, and it's just great.
Totally. So I've got your Twitter handle here. This is where you tend to reside the most. So if you are interested, when you're hearing this, about what Megan's up to as far as her research, you can go ahead and find her over on Twitter. And then again, like you've been kind of putting up, as you have studies coming up and you're looking for subjects, you've been posting that stuff up there. And the beautiful thing is, now a lot of the things, you don't have to live in Wales to participate.
Literally. It's
which I
great.
love. So even if if you're listening to this and you're not in the UK, totally fine. Megan needs you.
Megan needs great.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Megan, for all that you do. And we're excited to see kind of where things go with your PhD, and celebrate you when you're at the end of it. And thanks for being on the podcast.
No worries. Thank you very much.